Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are taking on a very challenging and I think a highly provocative question. It's one that really demands we rethink the last 500 years of global power dynamics. And that question comes straight from our source material. Who betrayed the African world revolution?
It's a huge question. And it really sits at the heart of the collected speeches of the historian John Henrik Clarke. The book itself was published under that title back in 1994. And, Clarke isn't just trying to revise history for the sake of it. He's leveling a really severe systemic charge. He's saying that the revolutionary struggle for total liberation and self-determination across the entire African world, it's been sabotaged.
Sabotaged.
Yeah.
And not just by the obvious external enemies, right? He's pointing inward as well.
Exactly. He argues he was sabotaged through crucial internal failures, which is, I think, the most provocative part of this argument.
So our mission for this deep dive is to get beyond just a summary of Clarke's claims. We want to really explore the depth of his analysis. We're diving into his fierce critique of Eurocentrism, his really unflinching look at post-independence African leadership.
And his assessment of why the Pan-African movement, which was born out of this desperation but aimed for total sovereignty, why it never fully got there.
Right. We're using his speeches to give you a clear, structured understanding of his argument, which, it spans continents and centuries.
It really does. And Clarke gives us a framework for it. He identifies three distinct geographical arenas where he says this betrayal happened. He argues this failure wasn't isolated. He says the momentum was systematically undermined in Black America, in the islands of the Caribbean, and maybe most critically, on the continent of Africa itself.
So to really get this, we have to understand how he connects these struggles, right? How they're all part of one global movement in his eyes.
Yes, and why he believes they all faltered at a sort of a similar critical moment.
Okay, let's unpack this. And I think we have to start exactly where Clarke starts. With the intellectual foundation of the whole thing, he sees this as a war, but a war waged against the mind.
That's the perfect way to put it. For Clarke to understand any of this, you had to go back to the 15th century. This is the era where, in his analysis, the European mindset really solidifies. It becomes this worldview that's just permeated by what he calls a toxic mix of ethnocentrism and xenophobia.
A toxic cocktail.
A toxic cocktail that resulted in Europeans operating under this belief in their divine right. The idea that they were somehow ordained to rule, to exploit, and to govern African peoples indefinitely.
When you say divine right, I immediately think of kings and monarchies. But he's applying it to an entire people, an entire continent.
He is. And the practical consequence of that belief was, the systematic reordering of global history. By assuming this divine right, Europe basically positioned itself as the subject of world history, the actor, the mover, the center.
And Africa then becomes the object.
The object of his story. And he's very deliberate with that capitalization, HIS. It's his story, the European narrative. And that intellectual subordination, for him, was the first and maybe the most damaging betrayal of all. It just erased African agency from the record.
It makes sense. If you control the narrative, you control legitimacy. And a huge part of that was manufacturing the whole dark continent myth. How does he say that myth was, actively sustained?
He's very clear that it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate historical and cultural erasure. And it was strategically promulgated to justify everything that followed. This version of history portrayed African peoples as, primitive, savage, inferior.
Devoid of knowledge and culture.
Exactly. The goal wasn't just to conquer land. It was to conquer the reputation of the people on that land. Because if you convince the world that the people you're colonizing never created anything of value, then your act of colonization suddenly becomes an act of civilizing.
A noble act.
A noble act, paradoxically. And what's so powerful about Clarke's work is how he just completely reverses that. He doesn't just say it's wrong. He says the exact opposite is historically provable.
Right. He says civilization didn't wait around for Europeans to show up with the light.
Far from it. He says history shows that Europeans themselves were in darkness, emerging from the Middle Ages, dealing with their own chaos. When the light of culture and knowledge was already shining from Africa and the Middle East. So he sees the European narrative as a complete inversion of reality, designed to hide their own intellectual and cultural dependency on the very people they wanted to dominate.
So if the foundation of European power is this distorted history, then for the last 500 years, the entire world has been operating under a worldview made in Europe's image. And this brings us to what Clarke says is the most dangerous tool of colonization, the weapon of education.
Yes. The intellectual war needed a delivery system. And that system was the education apparatus. Clarke sees colonial education not as a path to enlightenment for African people, but as a sophisticated tool, one engineered specifically for subordination.
He said it was designed to create mental confusion and dependency.
Exactly. It's an insidious system, right? Because it trains the colonized mind to believe in its own inferiority, but it uses the colonizer's own structures and metrics to do it.
It's basically psychological warfare waged through a curriculum. So what's the end result? The psychological outcome of being taught day after day that your history is worthless and your culture is backward.
The outcome is a profound psychological dependency complex. African people, through this kind of miseducation, were conditioned to accept the values, the culture, even the definitions of morality of the European colonizer as the universal standard.
Then that leads them to reject
Their own indigenous cultures, their own history, their own ways of doing things. And Clarke points out the really tragic result. They were conditioned to crave to be like their colonizers. They weren't just physically exploited, they were mentally infected. They lost their internal compass.
So even when the physical chains are gone, post-independence, the mental conditioning is still there. It's like a self-perpetuating system. He paints a really grim picture of this. He warns that the education system has darkened the true light of African history, leaving people brain dead, brain damaged, and culturally comatose.
So it's like an addiction.
It does, and it needs a detox.
And that analogy is perfect for Clarke's thinking. He asserts that as we move toward the 21st century, the absolute necessity was a radical intellectual intervention. This intervention required African people to actively de-Europeanize, demystify, detoxify, and de-brainwash the mind from this, as he calls it, drug of Eurocentric miseducation.
That's a monumental task.
Yeah.
You're talking about undoing 5 centuries of propaganda. But if you do that, if you detox the mind, where does Clarke say that mind needs to be re-anchored? What's the goal?
The goal is total restoration. By going through this process, the African mind can relocate its subconscious reference point, its locus, back to Mother Africa. And this isn't just about geography. It's a foundational shift in your whole intellectual and spiritual orientation. Clarke says over and over, you cannot build a common humanity while you're standing on someone else's foundation.
You have to stand on your own turf first.
You have to, rooted in your own history and your own cultural genius. Otherwise, he says, you just become a tool of the slave master's apparatus. The failure to get to true sovereignty in the 20th century, he implies, it started right there, with that mental failure to reject the oppressor's framework.
So to build that new foundation, Clarke insists we have to first reclaim the factual history that was suppressed. And he starts with what he calls a non-negotiable fact, that Mother Africa is the cradle of world civilization and culture.
This is the bedrock of his whole argument. And he states that this isn't just, an African truism. It's a universally accepted truth in fields like archaeology and anthropology. We're talking about the pioneering of fundamental human achievements.
Like science, religion?
Early concepts of science, organized religion, chemistry, mathematics, complex metallurgy like iron smelting, and maybe most fundamentally the concept of a moral code, of ethics. Clarke makes a point to emphasize that for the first 110,000 years of human history, only African people inhabited the planet. So to dismiss Africa's contribution is to dismiss the very origin of human ingenuity itself.
And when we talk about that ingenuity, the focus always seems to go to the Nile Valley, to ancient Egypt. But Clarke says we have to view it in a much broader context.
Yes, and that distinction is crucial. He sees it as a composite culture, not some singular isolated miracle. When European historians isolated Egypt, they often tried to disconnect it from the rest of Africa. They'd suggest it was influenced by Mediterranean or Asian peoples. Clarke just rejects this completely. He points out that the Nile Valley civilization was inherently composite. It was constantly being fed and renewed by cultural elements flowing up from the south, specifically from the regions near the Mountains of the Moon, which we now know as the historical sources of the Nile.
So it was like an intellectual highway, the river itself.
The ultimate means of cultural exchange. It highlights a foundational African unity that predates any foreign invasion.
So what were some of the specific, material contributions that Clarke emphasizes came out of this unified Nile Valley?
First and foremost, massive agriculture. The Nile's flooding was predictable, but it required collaboration and advanced planning. And that, in turn, necessitated the idea of people getting together for survival. This move from nomadic life to a settled, complex society led directly to organized irrigation, crop rotation, food storage.
It created surpluses.
Surpluses, which then freed up parts of the population to specialize. You start to see a sophisticated laboring class, a technical class. And as you said, the Nile itself became the world's first cultural highway, enabling unified communication, trade, and the sharing of political ideas needed to create the first organized states.
But he goes beyond the technical breakthroughs. He puts immense weight on the cultural and spiritual legacy, arguing that so much of what the West claims as its own ethical heritage was actually borrowed or stolen.
He is unsparing on this point. He highlights that the literature of the Nile Valley, especially texts like the Book of Coming Forth by Night and Day,
Which is often mistranslated as the Book of the Dead.
right, a terrible translation. He argues those texts predate or heavily influence foundational Western and Middle Eastern spiritual texts, including the Bible. And to make this connection tangible, he points specifically to the 42 Confessions of Ma'at.
The 42 Confessions. These are central to Egyptian concepts of spiritual justice. How does he draw that direct line between them and, say, the Ten Commandments?
He argues that the confessions, which are a negative declaration, the deceased states what they did not do before the court of Osiris, contain the ethical basis for the later and much more restrictive Ten Commandments. So, for example, a confession might say, I have not committed robbery. The corresponding commandment is, thou shalt not steal.
I have not caused pain.
Right, which implies respect for life and well-being. Clarke's point is that the European intellectual tradition often just extracts these spiritual laws from their African source, rebrands them, and then uses that modified spirituality to rationalize domination. It's an intellectual theft that supports their claim of being the bearers of morality.
Which puts that dark continent myth in a very sharp light. The claim was that Europe was bringing morality and civilization to a place that had already codified these concepts millennia earlier. But the history of Africa is also one of perpetual conflict. Clarke spends a lot of time outlining this history of siege.
He does. He outlines over 3,000 years of siege and resistance to show that Africa was never a passive victim. The early invaders were often Western Asians groups, like the Hyksos, the Assyrians, the Persians. They disrupted internal systems. But the really significant shift, for Clarke, was the first truly European invasion. That was the Greeks under Alexander the Great in 332 BC.
And that marked the beginning of a new pattern.
A sustained, destructive pattern of external control that ultimately led to this intellectual war we've been talking about.
And the history of persecution that followed. Clarke uses specific examples to symbolize this attack on African intellect. He brings up the murder of Hypatia during the Roman period. Why is she so important to his narrative?
Hypatia's fate, in the early 5th century AD, it just symbolizes the destruction of classical African and Hellenistic learning at the hands of these nascent oppressive Christian power structures under Roman control. Here you have an African woman, a brilliant teacher, mathematician, a philosopher in Alexandria. And her brutal murder by a Christian mob wasn't just a singular act of violence. For Clarke, it represents the moment the light of rational, diverse learning was extinguished by intolerant European political control. Her death marks a profound transition.
A transition from intellectual exchange to dogmatic subjugation.
Exactly. And following the Romans came the Arabs. Clarke's analysis here is really interesting because he acknowledges that, at first, some Africans saw the Arabs as preferable to the Romans.
Well, what was the ultimate outcome?
He views it as just an exchange of conquerors. While the Arabs often adopted a religion from African people rather than introducing it, they ultimately maintained a structure of oppression that just replicated the Roman and Greek patterns of control. The fundamental problem for Clarke is that foreign rule, regardless of its origin, is still a siege. It still prevents true self-determination.
But despite all these sieges, African history is also full of examples of successful military resistance. He uses these to show the blueprint for sovereignty was always there.
Absolutely. He reminds us of the Ashanti Wars in West Africa, which lasted over 200 years. He talks about Ose Tutu organizing a successful defense. He cites the Zulu Wars in South Africa, showing incredible military discipline against overwhelming imperial power. And of course, maybe most famously, Ethiopia's successful defense against Italy in 1896 at the Battle of Adwa. These conflicts prove that Africans had the will, the strategy, and the leadership to defend their land.
And this is where he brings in the great irony. The connection between this history of successful defense and the ultimate betrayal in the 20th century.
The irony is just tragic. The new generation of African leaders in the mid-20th century, the ones educated in colonial schools, they failed to learn from this legacy. Instead of innovating based on their own cultural genius, they became what he calls mission-trained radicals, who often just appeal to the colonizer's conscience, a conscience which Clarke states flatly, is absent from the makeup of the European colonizer.
So, by adopting the colonizer's framework, by imitating European governance, they walked straight into the betrayal. They traded a methodology of resistance that worked for one of imitation that ultimately failed. And this sets the stage for the systematic collapse of the revolution in the 20th century.
And this failure leads us directly into the heart of the betrayal, starting with Africa itself. Clarke observes a distinct, damaging transition, the shift from the pragmatic land-defending warrior period to the theoretically minded, missionary-trained activist period. These new leaders, they were steeped in European political theory, but they had no methodology of African rule.
Which leads to what Clarke so cynically calls the failure of flag independence. What exactly does he mean by that term?
Flag independence is about the exchange of flags without any fundamental change to the underlying economic, military, and intellectual structures of the state. The leaders, educated in European institutions, were prepared to imitate the slave master's rule, adopting the parliamentary system, the courts, the bureaucracy.
Instead of establishing something truly sovereign.
Exactly. Something based on indigenous African concepts of rule and community. It was a cosmetic change, not a structural revolution.
Let's use the example of Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah. He was such a towering figure in the Pan-African movement. Clarke suggests his revolution was sabotaged from both inside and out.
The Nkrumah's rise was incredibly inspirational. It galvanized the Pan-African world. But Clarke argues that many of the internal elites, the very people Nkrumah needed to build the new state, they didn't truly believe in his radical vision. They were that missionary-trained elite who felt comfortable under the old system. They deserted him, betrayed him when the pressure mounted.
And the external pressure, according to Clarke, was immense and calculated. What was the role of the West, particularly the U.S., in ensuring Ghana failed?
Clarke argues that the U.S. and other Western intelligence agencies actively worked to deny the world the existence of a well-functioning, stable, non-aligned African state. And the geopolitical reasoning was chillingly simple. Successful African states would multiply. He says if you produce 1, you can produce 10. If you can produce 10, you can produce 50.
So a single, sovereign, successful Ghana was a role model they couldn't allow to exist.
It was a threat. It would destabilize the entire system of Western resource extraction and economic control across the continent. So the destruction of Nkrumah's regime was a high-priority strategic operation.
But the betrayal wasn't just geopolitical. It was also rooted in a failure to address the core economic issue: the land.
That's the deepest economic cut. Post-independence, European landowners often just kept control of reserved lands. And crucially, the rising African elite, the very class that benefited from this flag independence, they actively participated in this. They used their new political power to buy up those reserved lands, effectively replacing a white landowning aristocracy with a black one. The structure of control didn't change.
And as Clarke says, if a people lose control of their land, they lose the foundation of their nation. This exchange of masters meant self-reliance was impossible.
Precisely. The revolution failed to redistribute power and wealth. It just redistributed access to corruption. And this problem was everywhere, including the Caribbean, where the crisis had its own unique roots.
Let's pivot to the Caribbean. It's a real intellectual paradox, isn't it? As Clarke notes, the islands were the birthplace of Pan-Africanism, yet he says the people there ultimately made the least use of the idea.
The irony is just stark. I mean, Pan-Africanism as a formal political movement, it owes its lifeblood to Caribbean thinkers. Henry Sylvester Williams, C.L.R. James, George Padmore, all from places like Trinidad and Barbados. They conceptualized global African unity, but at home, that concept often failed to translate into political reality.
What's unique about the Caribbean, though, is that long history of successful physical resistance.
Oh, that continuity is undeniable. African cultural continuity and active resistance lasted over 200 years to the most brutal system of slavery. You have to remember, the Maroon revolts in Jamaica and Berbice, these were successful, sustained movements. And of course, Haiti. Haiti achieved total freedom through a slave revolt before the American Republic had even solidified its own government. The motto for total liberation was right there.
Yet, despite that legacy, the political union attempts failed spectacularly. Why did the Caribbean Federation collapse?
Clarke attributes it partly to external manipulation, of course, but primarily to crippling internal division. The Federation fell apart because of intense inter-island rivalry and economic squabbling. The larger islands, like Jamaica, they were unwilling to pool resources or pay taxes to support the smaller islands. This fragmentation played right into the hands of the colonial powers.
And this political failure was underpinned by what he called the illusion of freedom. The emancipation they got was delayed and crucially misunderstood.
It was a political emancipation that lacked an intellectual and economic foundation. Clarke emphasizes that many Caribbean people were not preparing for the total leadership required for true self-rule. They were often focused on aping British mannerisms, living conservatively, mistakenly believing their status was superior to Black Americans or even some local whites. They had ambition, but no methodology for nation maintenance outside the colonial framework.
So failure in Africa was flag independence without land reform. Failure in the Caribbean was fragmentation. What was the specific nature of the betrayal in Black America?
Well, the struggle in Black America began with immense promise. You had movements like the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, and they started with local issues, equal education, equal pay for teachers, but they quickly expanded. The civil rights movement started moving toward a global Pan-African context, linking the struggles of African people everywhere. What was needed was an all-class basis movement to unify everyone.
But that unified global vision, that's where the power was. And Clarke says this movement was crippled by internal betrayal. Who are these betrayers?
He identifies them as a mix of confused ideologists, middle-class fakers, and just plain sellouts. These were individuals who had been granted some access, some moderate success by the system, and they chose personal gain over revolutionary principle. They were working with and for the people who had opened doors for them, often selling out the core radical ideas because they were tired of fighting or just scared of losing what they had.
And the main mechanism for this betrayal was the pursuit of integration. Clarke sees integration not as a victory, but as a fatal distraction.
A tragedy. The movement, he says, got fatally bogged down in integration, which he felt was misinterpreted as amalgamation. Instead of demanding a fundamental restructuring of society, a revolution, the focus shifted to modeling society on the corrupt and dying society of the oppressor. He laments that many Black Americans became overly joyful about just using the same facilities as whites, and in the process, they neglected their own institutions, their own economic base, to the detriment of the community's long-term strength.
And this speaks to a failure of leadership that goes way back. He traces the root of this ideological shift back to the post-Reconstruction era.
Yes, he cites Rayford Logan's work, The Betrayal of the Negro, which documents the systematic decline of Black political influence after Reconstruction ended in 1875. Logan showed that when that period of political betrayal came, white power brokers consciously selected leaders who would not challenge the new racial order.
And the prime example of the chosen leader who, maybe inadvertently, ratified that betrayal.
Booker T. Washington. Clarke notes that Washington was selected and elevated by white leaders. They gave him funds, publicity, public approval. It was a calculated move. They chose him not because they agreed with everything he said, but because his emphasis on industrial education and accommodation at the expense of immediate political rights, as advocated by Du Bois, provided a much less threatening path for the movement. His elevation validated a conservative turn away from revolution.
So whether it's Ghana or Jamaica or Alabama, Clarke is seeing the same pattern over and over: external suppression plus internal ideological compromise, which replaces radical goals with accommodationist ones.
Having laid out this pattern of betrayal, Clarke then shifts to the solution. And it requires a radical reclamation of identity and ideology, starting with a powerful redefinition of Pan-Africanism.
We often define Pan-Africanism in these vague, post-colonial terms today. What is Clarke's specific operative definition? He calls it an effort to reclaim.
He defines it very specifically. Any effort on the part of African people to reclaim any portion of Africa that has been taken away, mutilated, misunderstood, or misinterpreted by a non-African to the detriment of Africa. This definition makes it clear that Pan-Africanism isn't just a political theory. It's a restorative action against historical and intellectual violence. It's about getting back lost pieces of sovereignty, culture, and self-esteem.
But for it to work in the 21st century, it needs a strategy that unifies the entire global African community.
Yeah.
How does he see this modern Pan-Africanism working?
It has to be a strategic bridge. One designed to unify the African world community, absolutely Africa, the Caribbean, the U.S., the diaspora, and Asia. And the non-negotiable common denominator has to be Pan-African nationalism. The mission is singular: to achieve total liberation in the same Pan-African nationalist freedom boat.
Yeah.
This unity, he argues, is the only viable response to what he saw as the emerging global challenge of Fortress Europe 2100.
Fortress Europe 2100. That implies a hardening of borders, a consolidation of white nationalist economic power. What's the fundamental conflict he's predicting?
He predicted that Europe would increasingly consolidate its power, both economic and military, to protect its interests. And those interests invariably involve controlling external resources, many of which are in Africa. Pan-African nationalism is the necessary counterforce, a unified, self-reliant bloc that can stand against that aggression. And for Clarke, the historical proof that this can work lies in ancient African history itself.
He links this modern political idea all the way back to the first organized society in the Nile Valley.
Exactly. He sees the unification of the Upper and Lower Nile, the convergence of people from the south and north to form Egypt, as the original act of Pan-Africanism. It was the successful political act of putting a portion of Africa together for the benefit of all of Africa. This historical evidence, he thinks, proves that African people have the cultural memory and the capacity for global unity.
This whole intellectual restoration depends heavily on African centricity, which he sees as the engine for cultural and psychological change. How does he define it?
He defines African centricity as any sincere effort to regain what slavery and colonization took away and to restore African consciousness and nationhood. It's a profoundly holistic view. It's not just about historical research. It requires a multifaceted analysis, historical, cultural, intellectual, economic, of the African struggle across time.
And he has a very specific, almost political critique of the term we usually hear, Afrocentricity. He insists on African centricity. What's the weight he assigns to that hyphen?
This is a nuanced but really crucial point for him. He sees the hyphenated term Afrocentricity as a compromise, a subtle semantic concession. He argues the hyphen implies a hybrid identity, something rooted far from Africa. It suggests the distance or a mixture, not a pure primary orientation. By insisting on African centricity, one unhyphenated word, he's demanding an identity that is wholly rooted, without apology or qualification, in the mother continent. It's a linguistic act of total reclamation.
And the ultimate purpose of all this is to restore self-confidence. You have to look inward, listen to the voices of ancestors, and accept a fundamental economic truth.
The truth being that Africa is the world's richest continent, but its wealth is controlled by others. And that's precisely because African people lack the confidence and unified will to assert control. The necessary shift is to stop relying on external validation, external aid, or external definitions of value. This leads directly to the call for what he calls uncorrupted leadership.
And uncorrupted leadership requires rejecting external ideology completely, whether it's Western capitalism, Soviet Marxism, or external religion. You have to stand alone.
Clarke is insistent on self-reliance. He challenges the leadership to stop relying on external aid. He asks very pointedly why African nations accept the idea of sharing power with oppressors. He says, if you won't share power with you in this country, what makes you think you've got to share power with them in your country? The only true path is producing leaders who are accountable only to African people.
And to illustrate what this self-reliance looks like, what he calls being nation-time ready, he turns to a kind of unlikely model. Japan after 1905. Why Japan?
Japan, after defeating Russia in the 1905 war, provided a perfect lesson in modern industrialized self-reliance. They showed they were nation-time ready, which means they were technically and industrially efficient enough to produce everything necessary for nation maintenance. And critically, this includes food, defense, and indigenous industry for themselves.
And he connects this right back to the failure of the newly independent African states.
He issues a stark warning. If you have to depend on someone else's food to eat, their military to defend you, or their manufactured goods for your economy, you are not a sovereign nation. You might have a flag and a seat at the UN, but economically and militarily, you're still dependent. He uses this metaphor that just driving a Mercedes-Benz won't make you a nation. It just makes you an inadequate foot with a chauffeur. True sovereignty is material independence.
So the ultimate future has to focus on building a common humanity, but one that centers the benefit of African people first, drawing strength from African philosophy and spirituality.
And this requires a complete revolution, not an adjustment. Clarke's final warning is against compromise. You can't just patch up the old society. A revolution means a complete root and branch change, replacing the old colonial society entirely. The goal is a world where African people not only refuse to be slaves, but refuse to participate in the mechanisms of oppression in any capacity for anyone.
It's about building that foundation for themselves, for their children, and for the generations to come. It demands a break from all external dependencies and the courage to rule from their own turf.
John Henrik Clarke's analysis, it's a rigorous 500-year history lesson on the cost of compromise. The core insight we can take from his work is that the betrayal of the African world revolution lies primarily in the acceptance of foreign standards, foreign narratives, and foreign economic structures. And that leads directly to a psychological colonization that outlived physical slavery.
What really stands out is his insistence that the only pathway to recovery is through unified Pan-African nationalism rooted in a historical and cultural truth African centricity. History, for Clarke, isn't just a study of the past, it's a map. If you don't know where you're going, you can look back at where you've been to correct your course.
He forces us to confront the nature of conflict itself. Clarke reminds us that true liberation demands total commitment. If you are against all forms of oppression or slavery, you have to be against all of its variations, without choosing between lesser evils.
And he leaves us with a stark, challenging thought about power dynamics. He observes that in any conflict, if two parties both decide they want to win, they can find a way to peace. But if one party decides they want to win and the other decides they only want to survive, or worse, decides to die, the conflict just continues indefinitely.
And the African people, he concludes, must realize they have the power to win. The goal is a revolution more significant than any that has ever occurred in the Americas, including the successful Haitian Revolution built on the backs of slaves.
So the ultimate challenge Clarke leaves for you, the listener, to mull over is this. If you want to rule, you must stand on your own turf, rooted in your own resources, and have the unified strength and the methodology to maintain that rule. Do the current structures of the African world community possess that methodology to rule themselves, or are they still operating with the tools of the departed slave master? That question remains the definitive test of true sovereignty.